I'm Suzanne from Akbari, for those of you who don't know me, and I just wanted to say words of welcome. So happy to see everybody here today, and especially after that wonderful day we had yesterday together. And then I just wanted to ask Willow Lawson to start our session off.
Morning, everyone. My name is Willow Lawson, and I'm a member of the White Earth Band of Chippewas in Minnesota. I'm based in New York. And this is my second year of coming to the Munsee gatherings here at IAS, initially as a writer in the exhibition department at the American Museum of Natural History. I've been looking forward to these discussions today about museums and museum spaces. And like many of you in this room, I've had some of the most meaningful experiences in my life with my family and with my community in museum spaces. And I think that's what museums want to be. So it's a real pleasure to introduce McCallum. He is a citizen of the Munsee-Delaware Nation. I've gotten to know Ian when he's visited AMNH over the last couple of years. He is someone who approaches museum collections from a language lens. So, he has a really interesting perspective, and he's always getting diverted by the things that his community wants him to do. And Ian will be speaking with Suzanne, who has been very busy this summer in museums on the East Coast and in Europe. And I'm really excited to hear what they have to say.
Lahkeewiit, Wamawen, Nijis Munsee, Ian, Eelunaapeewi, So, and thanks very much to Will for that introduction. I have the pleasure of starting this morning. I welcome the teacher, the educator, the ancestor at the back of the room, and sort of making connections with items that are from Munsee-Delaware that are in other institutions worldwide. So this is part of the work that is done with a core group of us at Munsee. So that includes my cousin to the right of me, my sister who may be on Zoom, and there's others that are emailing with information and sharing what they know to really sort of bring the knowledge of items and ancestors that have been in other places for a very long time, and they bring it to. So I do want to highlight the fact that this isn't the work that I'm doing, but this is the work of a community. There's a lot of people that are interested in share what they can behind trying to figure out what these things can tell us. So I refer back to that poem that I shared yesterday morning. If you weren't here, I did talk about not using notes for my presentation, so using the oral tradition of the wampum belt, and hopefully muddle through my slides and remember as much as I can that's important for the presentation. I did want to highlight Scott Armstrong's quote though, and I make connections with the gossamer thin web, the threads of memory. And that's exactly what we're doing here in terms of trying to bring back as much knowledge as we can of different items so that we can share that with future generations of Munsee-Delaware citizens, but also the Canadian public and the public worldwide. So as Willow mentioned, I like to go to museums. I've always liked to go to museums. In my family, there was a term called museum legs. My parents used to give me the gears about that, where museum legs meant that you were tired of being in the museum, and that was my parents, not me. I could have been in the museum. So that's still a joke that's brought out on occasion. And I've always enjoyed my time. I spent a lot of time going to the Royal Interior Museum. I was a junior member. I had a membership card. I was a big deal when I was a young kid. But as Willow mentioned, in my adult years, I've come at it from a language standpoint, and I've always wanted to find out if there's more words that we can add to what we have as a community in terms of better understanding of things from history. So I'm actually melding my two loves. One, history, which is my my wheelhouse, language which I've come to learn more as an adult. And with the GJ belt behind the glass in that exhibition, there's actually another item that's of big time importance to Munsee-Delaware, and that's Nanatis, the goddess of health, the guardian of health, which is the item that's on the screen now. So the doll is in the same exhibition hallway as the belt was. I think it's just right around the corner, if I remember correctly. But this doll was given up by a community member from Munsee-Delaware in the very late 1830s or very early 1840s. And I'll go into a little bit of that story. But what I hope to do in the context of Nanatis is share the process of what we did with the GJ belt, and what we're trying to do is apply it to other items that we find. And keeping in mind, we're trying to build a protocol. So how do we welcome ancestors out of museums? How do we properly show them the respect when they come out, and how do we learn best from them, right? And what can they share with us, having been gone for well over 100 years? So you can tell that I forgot to delete in my multiple tasks at home. So you can tell me whether I failed or not, whether this is a spark or not. I refer back to Mark Harrington's publications that he did after he came to Munsee in the very early 1900s. And he's talking about a couple other big items that he scored. He didn't get them from Munsee at this time. He actually acquired them, and we haven't gone further back to understand where these items actually traveled, but the missionary Peter Jones took these items or got these items from Munsee in late 1830s and 1840s, and I'll put some context to this. So this is actually Peter Jones' quote when he collected them. I have in my possession 2 family gods, and Peter Jones actually comes from a First Nation community. So he's from New Credit, or sorry, Mississaugas of the Credit, which is just right next door to Six Nations. He travels all around Ontario, visiting First Nation communities. He's a Methodist missionary, so his job is to convert. And he didn't do a very good job of it at Munsee. We just didn't really take to it, but he tried real hard. His diary entries are full of exasperation, I think, at best. So he says, I have in my possession 2 family gods. One is called Pabokawai, the god that crushes or breaks down diseases. The other is a goddess named Nanatis, the guardian of health. This goddess was delivered up to me by Eunice Hank, a Munsee Indian woman, who with her friends used to worship it in their sacred dances, making a feast to it every year when a fat doe was sacrificed as an offering and many presents were given by the friends assembled. She told me that she was now restored to worship the Christian's God and therefore had no further use to it. There's a couple of things that are going on at this time, and I referred to what Jane was talking about yesterday, where she made the connection between New York City and the community. So these items probably were not given up in that they just wanted to be given up because they were converting to Christianity. There would have been a lot of heartfelt conversations behind this. At this time, I referred to that the land was not going to be given to Munsee, the south side of the Thames River. So you have a lot of disruption within the community. One, you have all of the south side folk who now have to come to the north side and have to find a place to live. And so now we have to negotiate with the Chippewa of the Thames in terms of making sure that that's their space, or what's going to happen in terms of that. So there's a disruption among where people are going to live and how they're actually going to coexist when they've been living on the south side of the Thames for well over 50 years. So the church, Peter Jones and his missionaries visited quite often. They established a school at the present little village of Munsee. So more of the kids are now being taken to the school. It's not a residential school, but it's the sort of the early form of a missionary school. And there's a huge, I forget who I was talking about with this last night. Joanne, I hope Joanne's in the room.
Right.
It's my memory thing.
Yeah.
We were talking about this yesterday where on the map it said there's a name called Turkey. It's not because there were lots of turkey. Well, there was a lot of turkeys down there, but that's an Serbian turkey. I don't know if the turkeys were turkeys, but the family came, sorry, I've lost my George. At the same time, in the 1830s and 1840s, there was a mass, not a mass exodus, but an exodus of about 100 people that went out towards Stockbridge because they weren't parented land. And maybe there was not enough territory. So you have the community now lose up to 1/2 or 1/3 of their population. And when you're talking about a very small group of people, let's say 400 people, you lose people who have that knowledge of the big house ceremony, the religious ceremony, or you lose people who now know how to properly feast the goddess Nanatis. You lose that support network. I can somewhat understand when I lost my language teaching colleague, Karen. Right, no longer now did I have someone I could speak and write emails to and text, stuff in the language. That support network was gone. So that's somewhat what's happening in the community, and it's a reluctance to actually convert to Christianity. There is records in the Delaware church that's local. The missionary actually has married people. Now, these people had already been together for a very long time, but they actually married and under the Christian church. And in those lists, you have people now recording English names or still traditional names. So it's a period of time where people are still holding on to their original Munsee names, but there's also some English names going on as well. So that sort of paints the picture of what's going on the Thames River at the time. And I'm only speaking on a Munsee sense. I know that Peter Jones is visiting the Chippewa quite a bit. Oneida's not there yet, so they haven't come up from the States to buy their land. That doesn't come until 1840. So this sort of provides that picture of the two communities that are on the Thames. Items are items, but what can an item actually tell us, right? Without, speaking to us in a human way, I suppose. So what we know about Nanatis is that it's an item that was used for the big house ceremony. So at various times in the year, much like the Longhouse of Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, there were times where the Munsee people would go into to the big house and perform ceremony. So a building much the same as a longhouse. I think John Moses talked about the masks, the carved masks that would have been on the poles on the outside of the building, but may have also been on the inside. And a relative from Six cut off one of these masks, hacked it off with an axe, and it's in the Royal Ontario Museum now. So we do have a very good knowledge of the big house, but written by other people. We have items that belonged in the big house. We've got a good understanding there. We've actually got pictorial evidence. So the little sketching and drawing is done by an Englishman who wasn't really thrilled about traveling in southwestern Ontario in the 1840s. So he actually stopped in Munsee. He didn't necessarily have any bad things to say about it, but he did take the time to draw the school and chapel house that I was mentioning, the first schoolhouse that was at Munsee Town. And then he did sketch the big house, and he said, well, another community member decided to take the roof off because he needed a roof for his own building, which seemed to suggest that the building hadn't been used for some time. So while our big house probably existed until the 1830s, with Nanatis being part of that, and Pabokawai, the other of the mask, there was a big house that was well used at Six Nations. A lot longer than that, Boston Creek, I think it's called. And the building actually was sold to a farmer They then put a second story on top of it, and it was offered to the Canadian Museum. Canadian Museum, I'm gonna say, it predates probably Ottawa, but it was offered to a museum if they wanted to take it apart, and it was declined. So all we've got left now are pictures. We've got photos of the one at Six Nations, but we've also got the drawings of the ones that are at Akbari. We know that Peter Jones is a controversial figure for a lot of First Nation communities. Again, he's a First Nations person, comes from the Mississaugas of the Credit. We know that he tried very hard to convert people on the Thames with varying success. His journals are well filled. He's the original taker of those items. So they were going back a long time. We know that this is a time period where our community is now starting to send students to a formalized type of school in a Western sense, right? So they're going to a building to be taught in the English language by priests, or not by priests, but by reverends of the Anglican Church. We have community members at this time. Charles Halfmoon is now being employed as a lay preacher, who's now being encouraged to translate the Anglican Book of Hymns so that conversion can be even easier within the community. Right? They're actually, I mean, what's amazing is that for a community of 200, 250, let's say 300 people, that they're putting the time and effort to hire someone from the community to actually translate the Anglican, I'm going to say the Psalm book, but also the Book of Hymns, so that the conversion may be a lot smoother, I guess. In 1821, Malin Burwell, who I guess was a bit of a shyster, he's a surveyor for the, he's a 1820 shyster. He was employed by the Surveyor General of the British Army to complete another survey of the Thames River. One had already been done in 1892 by another shyster named Patrick McNiff. So the reason I say shyster is that Malin Burwell, when he came through in 1821, decided to leave a lot of things blank. His job was to survey for townships, for settlements in southwestern Ontario. So he surveyed all of the townships that we're well aware of Caradoc and Southwold Township that are really close to where our community is currently. He decided that the people on the south side of the river didn't exist. So he did not include their village, and he didn't include their names on the census. There's a reason we know that, is that when the communities decided to write to the government and say, hey, you took our land all the way in the 1800s to, when Jacob gave up the belt, it was found that those names were immediately left off the list. And they were all people who lived on the south side of the river. So we know that potentially Eunice Hank was one of those people who lived on the south side of the river, who owned the doll. Part of that knowledge keeping of the Guardian of Health. So I share the census that was grabbed by Melissa and by Suzanne, and I was looking for the Logan family because that's who I'm related to. They're not listed, but on the detailed firsthand accounts that the Munsee people are sending to the Canadian government, Taylor Logan, Henry Logan all have depositions saying, I had 10 acres, I had 2 cows, I had 2 horses, I had chickens. I had a farm that straddled the path that led to Fort Stanley. So we have some shysterism going here with the surveyors coming through, people losing their land, people having to move, and it's like a community upheaval. We also know from Peter Jones, but also from later anthropologists, that there's a ceremony attached to Nanatis as well. I don't know much about the Big House. Again, I come from a language sense. There's lots of people that have wrote about it. There's a Six Nations account that's in it's in a book that was compiled by Robert. I'm going to say Grumet because I learned French, but it could be Crummett. He's compiled a book that talks about the Big House. But they use all sorts of terms in this one. Among the Munsee, the beliefs concerning the doll being were similar, but differed in detail. As to origin, Wolfe, who was a traditionalist from Munsee, his name is James Wolfe. and James was another south side. At one time, a man lay ill, likely to die, and his family called in a medicine man, a witch doctor. The shaman finally announced that the family must make one of these dolls and care for it, and that the sick man would then get better. So again, the doll needed to be taken care of. There's references to the fact that it can't just be something that you put in a box and forget, that it has to be treated with respect and it has to be brought out on multiple occasions throughout the year. And I've got to bring out the educator in here. So what can Anattis teach us? So in a sense, what I've been talking about is that it can teach us about our traditional religion, the big house, because in Ontario, 2 communities held the big house, Six Nations and Munsee-Town. There is record of a lot of people from Ravingtown coming up for the big house fix, right? So that all 3 communities were well connected, and that they would visit each other, and that the big house was an important piece of their life. We can learn about the ceremony behind the doll, behind the Anattis. We can learn more about the care. So what Eunice Hank actually had to do as one of the guardians of it. And we can also make those generation connections. So just like yesterday with Jacob's belt, Jacob most likely heard about the belt from his dad. He learned it from his dad, So we have a generational sharing of knowledge. Eunice probably learned it from her mother or from her dad. We learned about the family. So we're using the same sort of process where we reached out to the Dolsons, because it's not a Logan item. This is a Dolson item, the belt. We wanted to do exactly the same thing with the Natty. So we wanted to contact relatives and descendants of Eunice Hank, who, by the way, had her Munsee name on the wedding registry, the marriage registry. So she and her husband both have Munsee names. One of them is descended from Shemunk. So one was born in the United States and one was born in Six Nations. So we know quite a bit about Eunice herself. And then we're also wondering if that family moved on. Were they one of the families that moved, or parts of that family moved off to Kansas, to Stockbridge? Did they move out to Oklahoma? Right, so we've got a long stretch of trying to find relatives of Eunice. My favorite part is that it also includes language. So I'm hoping to delve into more things that we'll find out about the ceremony, but also words that we're missing in our dictionary, but also, hopefully the description of the ceremony that Eunice would have been part of. And again, the meanings behind these things. Just like we didn't have the word for wampum belt, until doing a little bit of research and finding it in Harrington's notes. Are there words now that we're going to find associated with the big house that can, describe and be used in a modern context? And I have to put on my Ministry of Education hat here. But we take one item. It's a physical item. We can all see it. We can touch it. We can hear it. The museums, archives, and universities have a responsibility in terms of sharing this community item. And as a community, we now have access to sharing that learning, which now supports our community programs. Because in language class, I always share what we're doing in terms of place name research, or if we found belts or we found masks. That's all part of community programming. But also it should be part of our K-12 programming in Ontario, right? The biggest question I get asked as a 52-year-old employee of the government is, where's Munsee? Because we're very Ojibwe-centric or Nation-centric in our province. They're the big communities, so they get all the noise. So when you're a Munsee person and you're saying, well, yeah, no, we have a very different history, have to go into a lot of explanations. So I think that this really can help where I'm from to understand Munsee people at a very level. How many of my kids get to learn about it in high school? I don't know whether Peter sketched this. Peter Jones sketched this in 1840, but he took a couple of sketches of masks. These are the two masks that people. One is from the Nicholas family. So John joined us yesterday at the Firestone Library. And he talked about wampum. One of these masks may belong to his extended family, John. And then the other mask is from my family, the local family. These are two masks we're still trying to, sorry, one of these masks we're still trying to find. So I'm gonna share with you the one mask we did. As a geek, a couple of years ago, I picked up Michelle Hamilton's book, which is called Collections and Objections. It's all about collecting the whole collective frenzy that was in southwestern Ontario at the time, where people would dig up things and keep them in their house. And it's sort of the birth of the modern museums in Ontario. It's a real troubled, dirty time in Ontario. People would rob graves and all sorts of things and put them on tables as antiquities and things like that. Michelle does a really great job of highlighting those in her book. When I read her book, though, she made reference to the doll, the Natties, plus the mask from Munsee in her book. So that sort of set me on a little bit of a journey of reaching out to Michelle and asking. She might actually be online because I wanted to share with her the fact that I'd be referencing the book. But reaching out to her, I said, do you know where the mask would be right currently? Because I'd love to see it. It is part of my extended family. I'd love to be able to share that with the community and family at home. And so she gave us the details, which is quite interesting. And there's a picture, I think, from the Harrington collection of the Natties way back in the day, kind of looking very much similar with her outfit on. And then also the vocal wide mask. Now this probably is titled, this mask, because you'll see in the next slide that the mask that we found doesn't look like this one. So it may be the Logan mask, it might be the Nicholas mask, and that's something we're still trying to figure out. So lo and behold, after many, you're not gonna say, of trying to find the mask, it's in Scotland. It's misrepresented. It was part of an African collection because Robert Livingston was an explorer of Africa for the British. And among all of the things that's in his collection is this one, and it's not clearly, it's not African, it's actually a Munsee mask. So we found it. We had a long conversation with the museum, Livingston Birthplace Museum in Scotland. It's a very small museum, but they want to work with us in terms of getting better knowledge, a better sense of the mask, and really hoping that they're open to maybe bringing it to an institution that would allow for what we're doing with the GJ belt, so that as community members, we can all see this mask. My belief is that this is actually the Nicholas mask, the one that belonged to John Nicholas, who gave it up to Peter Jones in 1840. And it's not the Logan mask. So we're still on the hunt, I guess, the hunt for the Logan mask. And again, these are all, it's exciting because you're in the presence of something that our community would have talked about, shared about, had social interactions with. The religion is now part of the equation. A very exciting time, I think. And as much as we can deride the internet and how we're always bothered by emails and text messages, it's really quick for research and making connections to people who can help you out. And I think that's the gist of, these are physical items, but the social connections, the people you can meet, friends you can meet, people who can help you out is what really matters and what you can share in return. So I think I'll leave it at that. Lots of the sheep wamble in, and then maybe in the future we'll actually bring the mask in.
I'm just gonna add a few words to Ian's, and partly because my voice is bad and I'm not gonna talk too much, but partly because I want to add a few comments that I think could be helpful for the discussions that we have a little later on. I want to mainly say a few words about a visit I made to the archives at the American Museum of Natural History in July, and it was really grateful to Kristen Mabel and her colleague Catherine Katzer for all their help in navigating those archives. And in going there and doing that kind of work, I was mindful of something that Mark Peters had talked about about 6 months before he passed. He had asked Melissa and myself to help him a little bit with some research, because what he was hoping to do was to work forward from the 1829 census that Ian mentioned a little while ago to learn about people who were in Munsee at that time. And at the same time, others would be working backward from today's communities to kind of connect those pieces and sort of understand the relationships of those family members. And with belongings, it's very similar kind of work. Ian has been talking about how it's possible to sort of work forward from the belongings to try to get a clear understanding of their movement through time and their interrelation with the people. And going to the archive was a way to work backward from the documents that are there and get a sense of how these connect. So I want to say a couple of words about language and a couple of words about access. With regard to language, yesterday, one of the points Ian made was that Mark Harrington was a field collector and anthropologist who was out there gathering belongings from the communities in an extractive way. But he was also extremely mindful of the details that might be provided, details of which community was being visited, which particular person the item was acquired from, and the language above all that was used to describe the items. And in the image up here, you'll see, and I'll talk about it in just a moment, the description that he attached to these items. He visited many groups, including what he called the Canadian Delawares, and he describes this in an article he published in 1908. He wrote letters at the time that article was coming out, and I was reading those letters this summer. And he's really worried about the language. The proofs have been sent to him. He's out visiting Cherokee, Eastern Band of Cherokees, and he writes this in August of 1908. He writes, "The proofs came out all right, and I can correct it here, except for the Indian words, for which I need to have my original proofs." And then he writes another letter 4 days later, frantic. He's like, "In looking over Dr. Whistler's letter again, I see that he evidently intends to straighten up the Indian words in the proof himself. But for God's sake," he says, "don't send it with the Indian words as they stand now. I'll be at the museum on the 17th and would like to go over these words with you." And he writes some other stuff about his travel arrangements, and at the end, he's like, "For heaven's sake, don't let it get printed until the Indian words are straightened out." Now, he was probably worried about his reputation, right? Probably what he cared about was publishing an article that would be up to the scholarly standards. But what he did, though, purposely or inadvertently, was to provide the language in a good way. And Ian talked about that yesterday, and maybe that'll be part of the conversations as we go forward. The items that were collected by Harrington came in 3 groups, and I mention this because it's important to understand in navigating the ways in which these items come in and what kind of information is available and how that can be made better with a priority on community use. The items came in 3 groups. We collected them in 1907, and then in 1908, he sold a small collection of silver brooches, which includes items from the various Lenape communities, as well as other communities from the region in 1908. And then he also provides a small collection of everyday items, spoons, paddles, pack straps, that comes in 1908. But the majority of the items, including the belt that's here in the room, and the natis, who Ian talked about a little bit earlier, comes by way of a very wealthy collector called Erastus Teft. So Harrington collects all these items. Teft has bankrolled him. Teft rents him an apartment on the Upper West Side of New York to catalog and organize all these items and care for them. And then they go into Teft's collection, and then in 1910, Teft sells them to the museum. So there's this kind of complex pathway, 3 pathways by which items come into the museum. And when you navigate the documents, you have to navigate all of this. And here in this slide, you see the entry for the brooches. You'll see below, I've kind of blown up that text, and you can see that he's got items that are coming from all 3 of the communities, and he's naming the families that they come from, including Amos Deleary is one of the ones coming from the Ojibwe at Munsee Town. But at the bottom, you see the stuff that's come from Munsee-Delaware, a brooch from Cephas Noah, one from Mrs. Joseph Dolson, and one from Chief Ellis Timothy. And also the name for the brooch in the language. So again, this is an important piece of how language is coming. And so that's the first group, that's the brooches, right? And then he writes a letter in May to one of the museum functionaries, Dr. Whistler. He says this: "Dear Dr. Whistler, on looking over my collections, I find the following items from the Delawares, right? These are the things that Teft did not want, right? They weren't fancy enough. 1 pack strap of Indian hemp, Munsee band. 4 wooden spoons, all different, Munsee, Moravian, and Grand River bands. It occurred to me, he writes, that as you have little Delaware material, you might like these, especially as the prices are reasonable. I would be willing to put them in with the bill for the brochure. And in this slide, you see these items. There's a pack strap, let's see it upper left, a piece from Cephas Noah, hulling basket from Lucas Logan, and a wooden spoon from Esther Jones. And at the right, you see a similar listing of details regarding items that's part of the stuff that went to Tufts before it came to the museum. And so the reason I share these is I want to give a sense of kind of how tangled and complicated the archives are. I mean, I spent time there working through them with the help of Kristen and her colleague Catherine. There's got to be a better way. There's got to be a way to make these materials more accessible, and in particular to make it possible to not have to go through every single belonging and dig into the records to find the family names. There's got to be a way to come in by way of the family names and then come to the belongings. And so I wanted to maybe just put it on the table so that we can think about that together, since we have so many community members and also museum people here. How can we do this better? And here what you see at upper right is if you go to visit like Mark Peters and his daughter Caitlin, and I went in 2021, Katie Sabella shared with us a list, and then when Ian and Stephanie and I went in the summer or in the fall, as a similar list that Karina shared with us, you get kind of a printout that gives you the basic information: who's the collector, where did it come from, what's the name of the locale, what is the thing, what materials it made of, and so on. But if you go digging in the records, you find all this other additional information. Now, when you're there, you can ask Katie or Karina, and they'll look up in their computer that only works in the building itself, because it doesn't work outside. You can't access those databases outside the building itself, as I understand it. They can check for you and see if there's a name associated with the electronic record. But you have to be there to do that. And also, it's not the case that every bit of information that's in the written documents, the pieces of paper that are in the archive, is showing up in the online system. So, you know, the family information seems to be so important. And so this is what I want to end with, is this question: how to make this information available to the families today so that they can identify their belongings, as things that belong, as relatives, even these very humble objects like the spoons and the pack straps. Identify these belongings by way of relatives and by way of family names, instead of having to do the process I described, where you have to go there and have someone to help you look up, and then maybe after that go and conduct physical records. So that's all I just wanted to add as sort of a supplement, a little quota to what Ian shared. And so
I'd like to introduce Mary. She is an Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, Lunaapeewiak. And Mary is a historian who has worked to recover and re-engage belongings of her ancestors in museum spaces. She is currently the director of research at the Center for Contemporary Native American Arts at IAIA.
Ani, hello, Menokisha, good morning. Bongishko Quay, Dishmakas, Dishkanzi, Bing, Donjaba, Nagito Dam, Shang Dao, Shaganashi, Noswin, Deleary. Miigwech to our hosts, miigwech for the invitation to present. Miigwech to Munsee-Delaware Nation, Delaware Nation at Reagantown, our relatives for making the journey to be here and to share this wonderful work. It's good to see so many familiar faces. As I was talking to my mother this morning, I was, thinking about the journey that I took to get here, and to do some of the work that I'm going to share with you, and my experience growing up on Chippewas at Thames First Nation. And my grandparents had a store, Munsee General Store, Frank's Gas Bar, and my mother's father, Frank Deleary, owned that gas bar, and that was my first job. And I think there's some stories floating around where I would open up that store on my own when I was 3 years old. And then there was my handout. Get money from everybody that would come in, and that might be where you know me from. Yeah, I ran the store and I pumped gas, and it was one of my first jobs. You know, as a teenager, you know, 13-year-old. But that place is very special to me. It's you know, a big part of my memory growing up. And it's had a big impact on our family and our community, and it was a space that, you know, people gathered at pretty frequently. I remember, you know, the mornings, people gathering at the gas bar for coffee, and some of the older men, you know, would sit and visit in the gas bar. So I wanted to, I guess, kind of just ground myself just a little bit, and I guess also my thanks, my travel companions here who came all the way from Munsee or Ontario as well to be here with me. My mother, Nancy Deleary, Gina McGanky, and her sister Denise. So wonderful that they were able to make the journey here and to be able to spend time with them. I worked with my mother and Gina on my research project, and I'm really happy to share some of that work here with you regarding reconnecting with Gitxaalisinaabeg, which formed the basis of my dissertation research as I was a student at the University of Oklahoma pursuing a PhD in Native art history, which I completed July of 2023. I'm new to my position at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's a 4-year tribal college focused on Native arts, contemporary Native arts. I'm also an alumni of IAIA, went through their museum studies program, and that space and that place has also been very informative to my education and to my growth, as well as impacting my family, that my mother's a graduate, I'm a graduate, and now my son attends the Institute of American Indian Arts as well. When I got the invite to present, the first person that I thought about was my friend, Vera White. My father is Grant Jones, and I thought about her. She passed away early last year, but as part of this research, I went to go visit her and doing kind of the personal work to reconnect, to understand and learn about family history, community history. So this is very much a personal journey for myself. And you know, when I was younger, we didn't always get along. And that might be a trend with her. But I felt compelled as part of my work to go see her, go talk to her, tell her that I loved her. And I'm so glad I did that. A few things that I wanted to share regarding the history and interaction of Indigenous peoples and museums. And I bring in kind of this really well-known painting, a portrait of Charles Wilson Peel. And if you run an art history circles, or maybe you took an art history class, and you know this image might come up. So it's a painting that he did in 1822. He was, you know, I guess all around American young man. He was a naturalist. He collected things, and in this painting, it's representative of the history of the impact that collecting practices and museums had on Indigenous people, but also the land itself. He positions himself in a position of authority. He's lifting up this red curtain for you to look at what's behind him. I don't know if you can see from where you're looking, but he has many specimens behind him, stuffed items, animals, taxidermy, but he also has other instances of I guess his allegiance to American identity. You see a painting, I believe, of George Washington up in the left corner. You know, his taxidermy tools up in front of him. He's got dinosaur bones in the back, and his painting palette out there in front of him. But it's representative of a time of massive collecting, right? There was an agenda there. The massive collecting from Indigenous peoples and communities, and all of that stuff was carted away. The ways in which those things were acquired were not you know, ethical, was not a concern, and was part of the salvage paradigm in the 18 and 1900s. which aimed at saving the evidence of dying cultures. So a lot of the collecting, happened on battlefields after massacres. Anthropologists going into communities, taking things that they saw and sometimes paying for them. And they would sell them for far more than what they paid for them.
It's my turn.
So Indigenous material items were hoarded away in private collections, homes and museums, labeled as oddities and curiosities, right? The narrative around Indigenous items and communities was not authored by Indigenous people. So there's a long history there of stories being told about Indigenous people, about Indigenous communities, and in some cases, stories not being told at all, supporting the erasure of Indigenous histories in connection to place, in connection to each other, in connection to family. But Indigenous peoples persist and our languages persist and we persist. And I'm so glad that we are here today to talk about this. In 2019, Rosalie Powell, who's Métis and I believe is out of Saskatchewan, did a reinterpretation of that painting, the collector, the artist in her museum. And she does this painting, I think it was a photograph originally, and then she painted it in 2019, is attempting to, or is disrupting the colonial view. So she says, as an Indigenous artist, I'm inviting the viewer into my world, where Indigenous peoples claim the right to exhibit their own culture and their own history. And I would add that not just to exhibit, but to research, to share our stories, to create, to remake beautiful things, and imagine a future where we are thriving. So how I came, I like the stories of how we kind of came, to this research and kind of what called us to do this work. And as I was starting my dissertation studies, I needed to find a methodological foundation for my research, and it was inspired by many different sources, my family, community, my relatives, but also some key Indigenous women scholars, and I wanted to share some of their work here, and maybe it'll inspire you just as it inspired me. So when I started doing this work, I looked to Diane Million and was made aware of her work regarding felt theory, and that our felt experiences, what we feel, are just as important in the knowledge-making process. So what we feel when we go reconnect with these items that our ancestors once held, right? How do we feel? And that's really important in the knowledge-making process and the reconnecting process. But the history of Indigenous knowledges has been fragmented and degraded. And as she states here, and I'll read her to quote Diane, is regarding felt theory, she underlines again the importance of felt experiences as community knowledges that interactively inform our positions as Native scholars, particularly as Native women scholars, that our felt scholarship and how we feel continues to be segregated as feminine experience, as polemic, or at worst as not knowledge at all. And that to decolonize means to understand fully as possible the forms colonization takes in our own lives. As part of a story, right? It's part of the story that should be remembered and told, but the idea is now that we are adding to that story, right? Adding to what we know, adding to the biography of the things that we are interacting with, that the story of those objects that didn't end when they went to the museum, right? We can go rework with them and add to that story. Another person that you are probably familiar with is Leanne Simpson. And this quote is from As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance. And she says, our knowledge system, the education system, the economic system, and the political system, and she's referring to her community, the Munsee-Delaware, were designed to promote more life. Our way of living was designed to generate life, not just human life, but the life of all living things. And I would probably extend that to other Indigenous communities as well, right? The lives that we created to live in the times that were detrimental to our people. We were still creating, you know, even as our children were going to the boarding schools or being removed from our land, right? We were finding ways to make that. I think I'll also add that a part of Leanne's work and this act of making, this act of generating life was really informative for me as I thought about, you know, approaching some of these ancestral belongings, Gete-Anishinaabe. And I started using Gete-Anishinaabe and traditional instead of object or item to reference the multitude of relationships that they represent, not just as a physical thing, right? But all of the relations and kinship and networks that are connected to those things. And the work that we're doing now, that you're doing now, is reconnecting those lines of relationality. And I didn't come, you know, to this realization on my own as I'm sharing some of the scholars that have done this work before me. I've worked with Amanda before, and we've done exchanges, you know, years ago, looking at the personhood of ancestral belongings, referring to them as elder objects. And then now as I did this research, I was like, okay, well, let's look to our languages and maybe that can give us some more indication of the multitude of relationships there. So Gete-Anishinaabe is a term that I've been using for when referring to ancestor belongings. An artist that I want to share with you is Diani Whitehawk, and she is Sichongu Lakota. I heard a keynote presentation that she gave quite a few years ago at the Native American Art Studies Association conference in Minneapolis, and she went to the Institute of American Indian Arts. We were there at the same time, became good friends, and is doing wonderful things right now in her art career. And I'll read this quote that I pulled here for you, and she says, "I strive to create opportunities for connection and healing. And this is why my work speaks first through beauty. Beauty possesses medicinal qualities. It is a common human language we all speak. It is something we all crave and we are filled by. This is the part of the work I want my work to continue to do. I feel it when I visit the collections and see the work of our ancestors, and I know how impactful that feeling is. I seek to create work that we recognize first in our bodies and second in our minds." So the idea of beauty, right, and how healing beauty is, the beauty of going to visit ancestral belongings or Gete-Anishinaabe, the beauty of reconnecting in that journey, and recognizing the beauty of the things our ancestors made at one time and how we can recreate that beauty now. I will add regarding this idea of beauty in our visual landscape. So as these items were being removed from our community, removed from what we see and interact with, I think that had a really big impact on our community and our families, you know, and the individuals. And there are artists and scholars and researchers who are trying to bring those back, right? Bring that back into our visual landscape, whether it's through making or relearning how to make things or revisiting ceremony and songs. And maybe we didn't just make art. Well, we didn't just make art, but we made language, ceremony, songs, and other things, right? So all that making kind of comes into this. A couple of weeks ago, Dr. Michael Yellowbird visited the Institute of American Indian Arts, and he delivered a lunchtime presentation for our students on neurodecolonization, sacred object. Well, it was more like neurodecolonization, but the title here is what kind of caught my attention. Because he had this slide up talking about sacred object meditation, and he talks about the power of mindfulness and the power of meditation in healing the mind or decolonizing. And he had on this slide this quote, and he said his belief, it had a picture of an Arikara man sitting in a lodge with pipes in front of him. And that quote was in reference to that photograph. And he says his belief in these sacred objects also enable him to grow neurons of resilience. So if in his mind he can call upon these objects when times are difficult, he will revisit optimism, joy, and well-being. There are studies out there regarding stress and unresolved grief, historical trauma, how that affects the brain and leads to brain degeneration. But Dr. Michael Yellowbird is talking about, the practices of meditation, but not just, the mindfulness, you see people sitting there, but meditation through indigenous contemplative practices such as prayer, song, and language. And maybe even making, right? The act of sitting together and making things as part of those indigenous contemplative practices. And we talked about decolonization as having a material consequence, right? That there's actually something happening. Decolonization is not a metaphor, but there's a material consequence to decolonization. But through this process, through reconnecting, through working with our ancestor belongings, our Gete and Anishinaabe, that maybe there's a cellular, and this is what Michael was saying, a cellular neurological change to our physicality, right? What is happening to our physical selves. Now, I haven't really done the deep dive into his work, but I think there's another layer there of what's happening when we do this reconnecting work. So how I came to this research is quite interesting. I remember hearing yesterday, I believe it was Karen talking about how, some of these stories that weren't told in our families anymore. These histories weren't necessarily told in our families anymore. And I experienced that too. And maybe it was because, my age, or I wasn't asking the questions. But as part of my work, I wanted to go find out what there was. Being at a tribal college and seeing colleagues and students pull on their ancestral knowledge, ancestral art forms to inform their work. I was like, hey, where's our stuff? Where did that stuff go? So I was doing a research fellowship in Norman, Oklahoma at OU when I was sitting in my, curatorial intern office, and I would just start typing in Munsee, and it was our Munsee town, and I knew there, we have shared histories, and we're all intertwined, and there's overlap and things like that, and came across Harrington's paper, Munsee-Delaware. And I was like, all right, so he visited Munsee-Delaware Nation. This is wonderful. Maybe he went to other communities, and he did. I read through his paper, and there are wonderful pieces of information, and some things that are also really complicated, and I guess problematic, for a number of reasons. But one of the things that kind of caught my attention was when he stated, although retaining Indian physical characteristics to a large degree, all these bands are rapidly losing what little remains of their old culture. So came across this paper, then I started saying, okay, well, where's the record held of his travels? And I don't recall the jump that I made, but somehow I found his notebook, his ledger notebook that documented everything that he purchased from everyone that he visited on his travels throughout Southwestern Ontario. Now, I know that you're probably familiar with the area, but wanted to show a map. And as I was thinking yesterday, we actually need a map, and maybe there is one, of the three communities that reside in very close proximity to each other: Munsee-Delaware Nation, Chippewas of Thames First Nation, and Oneida Nation of Thames. As you can imagine, these three communities to be in such close proximity to each other, again, intermarriage, a lot of shared histories across borders, and I think that's the beauty of life, right? And we're really making life, so part of our making practices. So Harrington, there's the map. Went to Walpole Island with Sarnia. Went to, the Delawares at Meridian Town, stopped in that Munsee Town area, visited the Oneida, Munsee and Ojibwe, went off to Six Nations, went up to Akwesasne, went up to Cattaraugus, and did time up there gathering things. And I imagine his process was, knocking on doors, going from house to house, asking what they had to purchase. So I had his ledger notebook, and then And then I found his pictures, which are all at NMAI, National Museum of the American Indian Archives. The picture on the left here is Harrington himself. They all being white anthropologists, male predominantly, just love dressing up and playing Indian. So here he is, dressed in Haudenosaunee clothing, from 1905. So he was a pretty young man when he came through in 1907. So he did take a multitude of pictures from his time, and the picture that you see here on the right is David Seneca with a young boy standing in front of a bark and wooden dwelling. I have a few more pictures that I want to share, and I don't know much about them, and I share them in hopes that maybe those community members do, and maybe you might see a familiar name, and that might mean something to you. And I'd be more than happy to share any of these documents, should you want them. So before I go through, I just want to add that notebook had over 400 items that he purchased during his exhibition. And that's quite a good number of items. So we have in parentheses, because these are Harrington's descriptions, they're not my own. Delaware man, Elijah Logan from the Moravian Town Reserve, front view wearing a pouch, 1907. I don't think I've seen these items at AMNH, but that doesn't mean that they're not there, or at NMAI, or maybe he kept. Munsee-Delaware woman and baby, Mrs. Rachel Waddlove. As I was seeing some of these names, you know, one of my aunts, Sherry, married into the Waddlove family at Munsee-Delaware and currently lives there now. Ojibwe girl in Anishinaabe, Munsee Reserve, 1907. There's something familiar about her face. An Ojibwe bark outhouse. Anishinaabe, Chippewas, Harrington also asked David Seneca to make a model of a bark house, and that bark house, the model itself is at the American Museum of Natural History collections. I think this is a beautiful photograph of Jemina Schuyler, wife of Jacob Schuyler with pack frame, Oneida Reserve, 1907. Oneida Indians is what Harrington referred to this as, 1907. When I first saw this image, I wondered, I was like, why would an Oneida chief, because in other photographs he identifies this as Chief Danford, an Oneida chief, why would an Oneida chief be wearing a Mississauga like clothing? And I didn't really, you know, at the time hadn't really kind of dived in. And one of my mentors was like, well, maybe the women in his family were Mississauga and we're making these for him, you know. So there's questions, right, that we can ask, and maybe we don't know the complete answer, and maybe we'll come to it. But as it turns out, that these items that man is wearing, some of them came from Mrs. John Henry or John Tecumseh Henry. So Harrington was staging photographs and adding in things from other nations. So I guess the takeaway here is to have, you know, a critical eye when looking at these kinds of things. And it's not to say like, that's not, you know, what you guys did or what you guys were, but to really just kind of, you know, untangle some of these threads, right? These histories and these lines of relationality. We were at Delaware woman, Olivia Lewis, front view. So he also had a side view of Olivia Lewis. And then you know, as I look back, you know, when I talked to my grandmother Vera, you know, about her parents, you know, Joe Wide-Eye and Lila Hopkins, and then there was a Lewis in there somewhere, and I was like, oh, you know, maybe there's a connection here. But you know, photographs from 1907 or even, oh, really? Okay, we have a connection. Can you share or?
If I can recall, Olivia, and she had a sister, Josephine Lewis. And Josephine married Frank Fox from Chippewas of the Thames. Josephine and Frank had a daughter named Lillian, Lillian Fox, and Lillian Fox married my grandfather, John Huff.
Wow.
It's almost This is wonderful. So that's, what is that, great aunt?
Have you seen this picture before? No.
So you know what I want.
Yeah.
Rosanna Hopkins was my Great. Great. Because Rosanna and Hannah Stonefish were sisters. So you're related to me, her.
Yeah.
And her.
Sorry, say that again.
Poor
I said
thing.
you're related to four of us over here.
Hello, cousins.
I was trying to figure that out and I was gonna ask you, but I was thinking, I remember my mother telling stories and the Hopkins line and I was sitting here listening and I was trying to think, well, wait.
Vera Jones and my mother were first cousins.
Awesome. And I think that's really great to know, right? And coming to this and thinking about the genealogical research, and how difficult and time consuming that can be. But these items facilitate these kinds of discussions and are important, I think, to share across communities. And in my experience, if we don't know the story, oftentimes there's another community that does. And I think, that's very beautiful too. I know I'm reaching the end of my time here, so if I could maybe have like five more minutes, because I want to share some images of Get to Anishinaabe at the American Museum of Natural History. And I don't have complete details on everything, but I visited quite a number of items. And I told, Katie, when I went to visit, I want to see everything. And I spent 5 days there in the collection. I went by myself, which I don't encourage people to do because it's, difficult to do that kind of work on your own. But I was scoping it out, right? And I was exploring what this kind of research meant to me. So when I got there, I had Harrington's ledger notebook. I know what he had. I had some references from the database, which as we know are incomplete. And I didn't have the piece of information that connected the item to the items that he wrote down in his book. But going to the archives provided that information. So there was a lot of additional steps in addition to going to the database and finding all of this to reconnect, some of this work. So when I went in, I pretty much, I had the item, but I didn't have the associating information with it. So, here we go. The items. So here's a page from Harrington's notebook. And as coming to the language myself, a second language learner, I would have to rely on our language speakers to decipher what's in here. But as others have stated, he did a really good job at documenting the things that he bought and how much he bought them for. But one word that I could recognize is this word right here, and maybe you recognize it too, and it's moccasinan, which refers to moccasins. And what I was excited to find those moccasins in the collection, but again had to go to the archive and from this number to this number to that number, because the numbering systems change. And actually I think this little black moccasin here isn't the one referenced in his notebook, but the bottom three right here, this little black moccasin, the bottom three that you see here are the ones that he references in his notebook that belonged or were sold by Betsy Huff, who is a matriarch of the Kishigo family. So, you think about looking at these moccasins, the kind of care that was put to make them, and the smallest one fit in the palm of my hand. You don't see puckered moccasins being made like this anymore. So the craftsmanship, the stitching is beautiful, and they've been repaired, right? They show signs of repair, which indicates a number of things, right? Access to materials, passing down the moccasins from family member to family member. So it indicates a lot of things. And as a moccasin maker myself, it's been difficult work learning to make puckered moccasins. And these are just a wonderful example, I think, from our area. So I talked a little bit, or I mentioned Mrs. John Henry in the archive at the American Museum of Natural History. There's an interesting conversation from Michelle Hamilton, not the one that wrote Objects and Collections, but she was from Boston area, I think worked in a lawyer's office and was really interested in what Mrs. John Henry was wearing. And actually did a recreation of it. She was a non-native woman. There are pictures of that recreation, a doll that she made in the collection as well. So Mrs. John Henry sold a number of things to Harrington, and he captured this beautiful photograph of her wearing the things that she had sold, and the skirt that you see here on the far right is just a beautiful example of the work and craftsmanship of her or women in her family, however maybe she received this item. So I wanted to include some close-ups here. You know, there are others who are probably more well-versed than I in what is here, but you know, I see otter-tail designs, maybe the colors mean something. I see, you know, trilliums and you know, all the curly cues. And I think that there are connections between these items and the Peter Jones and George Henry Mungwoodhouse families at the Royal Ontario Museum. So these are, you know, the pictures are beautiful themselves, but the trilliums, the otter tail design, and the colors again are very beautiful. So the pictures are, you know, black and white, you don't really see the colors. So when you see the vibrancy of these fabrics, they're just amazing. And I saw a dress at the Citizen Potawatomi Nation Museum that had a similar cut to this dress with the jagged or zigzag edges. And maybe there's connections there. So, you know, doing this kind of work, I'm always constantly looking out for connections, right? The snakeskin bag that Mrs. John Henry is wearing resembles the snakeskin bags that are at the Royal Ontario Museum. And then of course she has the leggings and moccasin tops, in addition to other items that she had sold to Harrington. So a part of this work, after I had, you know, done my work with Harrington and at the museum, and then my next step was to go home and do some interviews. And I had told my mother that I was gonna go, you know, do some hit up some museums in Ontario, and they wanted to come along, so we arranged for a group of about 6 from Chippewas Thames First Nation to come along to visit museums, go behind collections, and just explore, you know, like what reconnecting, looking at these things means and feels like. So I had Gina and Nancy, Betsy, Sarah Riley, Betsy Kishigo, Sarah Riley, and Maxine Hendrick come along to visit and go behind the scenes in these collections. So what you see here is a bag that was sold. Yeah, the wife of Chief John Tecumseh Henry. Michelle, the one who was researching this information, didn't know her name, and apparently nobody knew who Miss John Tecumseh Henry was. But as we were talking, Betsy was like, "It's Nancy." Her name was Nancy. So I'm gonna add that to, you know, the record, the file, or whatever, to see if there's any mention of Nancy Henry. And you see Sarah down below here looking at that bag, and she was really interested in that figure on the top of that bag, and she said, "I think that's Henry." As you know, the ears and you know you could change shape and form. So Sarah was really very pleased. So these items, they were on display, but they took them off display for us to look at, and were acquired by an Iroquois man, and I can't really say his name, but our own Haiteka collection. But he donated this collection and wrote about it in his catalog that accompanied it. And he said that these and other articles in this collection were worn by the chief and his wife when they represented the Caradoc Indian Reserve and presented an address to the Prince of Wales on the occasion of his visit to Canada in 1860. One item that I was particularly interested in looking at from Harrington's notebook was this mention of Julia Deleary, Ojibwe, who sold a pipe, tomahawk, wagak dospawagan, and was able to match up his mention of it to that pipe at the American Museum of Natural History. I don't know what the markings on that pipe mean. I can't tell if it's been used, but I have been told that if it's been used, that we can use it and find additional information about it. So I think, you know, that would be a wonderful thing for community to be a part of. So I knew that we had a Julia Deleary in our family line. So when I went to go talk to my Aunt Sherry, Sherry Waddler, she told me a bit about Julia. My mother has a memory of Julia. And, you know, learned a bit about her. She married, or I don't know if she married, but had a child, Gladys Madison, with Joshua Madison. And then later on married George Nicholas, who I believe was a chief at Munsee-Delaware Nation, and they had 3 children, Floyd, Linwood, and Faye. So, you know, the interconnections just kind of keep coming. Earlier this year, you know, because there is an abundance of spoons, right? We talk about spoons, like what are spoons? And of course they were used, were everyday household items, but they're pretty elaborate. And when I showed this, the spoons in at the residential school gathering earlier this year, one of the ladies was like, well, I heard a woman talk about, you know, that her marriage wasn't complete because her husband didn't make her a spoon. And I was just like, really? You know, I was like, okay, so that it signifies something more, right, than just the item as we know it today, a spoon that you use, right? And maybe that's why there's an abundance of them, I'm not sure. So one of the things that was inspirational for me, we're training our eyes to see these stories again. And that comes from Sherry Farrell-Brissett, who has been very instrumental in her own work and inspiring for me. And that there are an abundance of stories in this bandolier bag, and I only know one, and that's with the blue maple leaf. And that every once in a while, a maple tree will produce a blue maple leaf. And it's, this was told to me at a gathering at the Idle again with some Great Lakes items. And a young man from, or not a young man, but a man from Manitoba shared what the blue leaf symbolized, and that when we make things, you put that blue leaf on there to symbolize the uniqueness that is you, because you are, you know, one in a million. And I want to talk briefly about some of the women that I talked to, including Gina and Nancy, about the things that they remembered about making. But I might have to save that for another time and talk briefly about the process of reconnecting. And when I was kind of going through my studies, you know, and learning about how to engage with collections, and Sherry was there and was like, well, you know, we have students, we go in the collection and we're all just kind of standing around and we might pick something up and look at it, but she's like, what are we doing with our hands? Like, we're not doing anything, you know, with our hands. So she would encourage people to draw as a way to guide their eye, to ask questions, to take notes, to add to that biography, to add to that record. So here we have a drawing made by Gina of a bowl at the Canadian Museum of History. And what Gina shared about that bowl, and I just want to read it here for you, is that with her permission, there is versatility for one bowl, symbolizes our own life to be able to pass down our knowledge of gathering food, making of traditional material to make the bowl, to share and nourish our family and people, to carry the water to help healing process. Everything has a role and responsibilities. We still do it today. We are a versatile people and will use all the things we learned and will survive for many years to come. And then my mother Nancy wrote about a quill work box who reflected that she said very much like the basket my grandmother Eva Jane Schilling made from Rama First Nation in 1970s with Aunt Hannah Joe, Aunt Pearl Schilling. Basket making bees were held at each other's home to make these baskets for tourists. And that was a connection that she felt to that pearl basket. So in closing, what has been shared with me is to never stop looking. And that when you keep looking, you'll be surprised at what you find. Miigwech and Ashik for your time.
That was amazing, Mary. I want to introduce Amanda McCallum. She's a citizen of the Sakine First Nation. She's curator, conservator, and historian. And she has consulted with the American Museum of Natural History on the care of the belts.
Ani everyone, my name is Amanda McLeod. I'm an Anishinaabe and a member of the Sakine First Nation or Anishinaabe Nation in Manitoba. Right now I am residing in Winnipeg, which is just over an hour away from Sakine, so it is all in Treaty 1 territory. My background is in conservation and curating in the museum. So when I first was trying to decide what I was going to do with my life when I was a teenager, I tried a couple things when I went into my first degree at the University of Alberta. And my mom is actually a professor of Indigenous art history at the University of Manitoba, Dr. Suzanne McLeod. But I ended up trying two things. And then finally in my third year, I was like, okay, fine, I'm gonna do it too. And she's like, okay, it took me long enough to figure it out. So I kind of veered into the arts field and into the museum field, and I got a degree in history, art, and native studies. And then worked a series of odd jobs and everything. And then when I turned 30, I was like, what am I doing with my life? So I decided to actually join my mom on a tour that she was doing. She was teaching at the University of Calgary at that point, and she had brought her students to the Glenbow Museum, and they were taking a tour of the archives in the background with Jerry Conady. And I joined along, and he was pulling out all these drawers and opening all these cupboards, and he was showing all these objects, and he said, like, a lot of these objects actually have those specific protocols, but there aren't very many First Nations conservators in the field. And he talked about conservation, and I had never heard of it at that point. And I was like, speak up. And so I looked it up, and I thought, wow, this is great. It's got the history aspect, but it's got the hands-on aspect as well. And then also I was thinking about how, like, for so long, museums held patrimony over our objects, and they kind of had the attitude of like, well, we know what's best for your objects, we'll take care of them. And so I wanted to go in and get the training so I could be like, well, actually, I know as well. So I kind of veered off from museum studies, in museum studies at that point, and decided to do curating. So I moved to London, England, and I trained there for 3 years in conservation. And then I did a series of internships at the National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian, and at the Museum of History. And then in 2016, I decided to move to Winnipeg, back to where my family is, because I have two sisters who are twins. One of them was pregnant, and it was the first and still only out of myself and my sisters. And so I was like, I'll move there for a year, I'll help you out. But the reality with the museum field is, like, generally you move for the jobs. And so I was like, I'll just be there for a year and then I'll figure out what I'm doing after that. And I was 2016, just for 1 year, right? So I said I was going to be there, I'd help her, I would like do laundry, I would clean, but I wasn't so much a kid person at that point. And then my nephew was born, and then it ended up being that I can't leave Winnipeg. So he's the one that's really kept me there. And so this is my nephew Noble. He's gonna be thrilled that I tossed him in the song, right? So what I'm actually going to talk to you about here is my experiences in conservation and curating. And so in Winnipeg, I ended up actually working at the Manitoba Museum for 4 years, and that's actually where I met Mary. And so I worked with Dr. Maureen Matthews there. And I came in as a researcher, and then I kind of fell into curation because they were doing a massive gallery renewal. And I started to develop their Indigenous content. And so when I did it, I approached it from an indigenized perspective, which I guess is actually technically a methodology, but I didn't know at that point. It was just what made sense to me in working with my own community. But I attended a GRASAC gathering, and that's where I met Melissa. And we had talked about the wampum research that I had actually done 10 years ago when I had done my conservation degree. And so I'll give you kind of a rundown on that. And again, it's been a decade since I've done this research, so I have to kind of like reacquaint myself. And I do have to be really honest, when I do talk to youth a lot in terms of trying to encourage them to go into the museum field, because we do need a lot more Indigenous representation, and especially in conservation, because again, there are so few of us in that field. And I do say that, you know, it is really scientific based. It's a lot of chemistry. I had to learn physics because I learned how to do laser cleaning when I was in school. And I'm so not a science person. But I was able to kind of change the way that I would think of stuff. And again, that's a decade ago, so I was trying to refamiliarize myself with this research. I kind of understand it, but I did a decade ago. We'll see how I do explaining it to you guys. So the first thing is kind of like, what is conservation? And so the definition that I have here is what used to come up when you Googled it. And it was a very kind of colonial view of conservation. So it focuses a lot on just the material culture. And the thing with Indigenous objects is you can't just think of it as materials. You have to take into account the meaning behind it, who made it, the community, the spirit that was in it, and that should inform any treatment or anything, any non-treatment that happens with it. And the good thing is that the field is evolving now, especially from when I was in it a decade ago. And again, I was in Europe also studying, and their attitudes are very different there. And so now, if you look at conservation, the definition a lot of the times that you'll see is conservation is all actions aimed at safeguarding cultural heritage for the future. The purpose of conservation is to study, record, retain, and conserve as appropriate the cultural significance, apply qualities of an object with the least possible invention or intervention. So now it's saying that we're actually starting to incorporate the information from source communities. And it was pretty funny because in 2018, I actually went to London to go to the Royal Anthropological Institute conference. And they were there, and there was this whole new groundbreaking idea over there where they're like, guys, we can talk to the source communities and they have so much information. And it was like, okay, well, we're getting there. Baby steps. So for my wampum research, very specifically, my dissertation was called Lost Bees, Missing Stories, preliminary study of the effect of relative humidity on the deterioration of wampum bees. And so the program that I took in London, it was a 3-year program. And in between my second and third year, I was required to take to do an internship and then also kind of figure out what my big research project was going to be in my third and final year. And so I was able to do a placement in the conservation department at the Smithsonian at the NMAI. And I was starting to get a little freaked out because I was coming close to the end of my internship and I still hadn't figured out what I was going to do my research on. And so at that time, they were preparing for the Nation Station exhibit, and they had these series of wampum belts that were going to be in it. So I was tasked with doing the photography of the belts. And so while I was looking at the belts, I was noticing that there were these beads. Beads were missing from these belts, but the threading material was still intact. I was like, okay, so then that means that was a failure of the beads. The beads were breaking. And at the NMAI, what was really good is as a group of conservators and interns, we would come together a lot of times and we would talk about the objects that were being worked on for exhibits. And so I was like, okay, well, we'll probably talk about this when we get together as a group. And we did, but I was noticing that the focus was on the threading materials. They kept talking about how important it is to worry about the threads and everything. And I was like, yeah, but what about the beads? Like the beads are breaking. So I kind of brought it up and it got pushed back towards the threading materials. And I was like, okay, because like things like shells, And like stones and stuff, a lot of times are thought of as being like inorganic materials are thought of as being pretty stable. So I guess like the worry wasn't too much on the beads, but I thought that was ironic because like the context is in the beads of the belt. So like we need to figure out why the beads were breaking. And I thought, hey, this could be my research. And so when I came back to my school and I told my classmates what I was doing, they actually started laughing because it might be kind of hard to tell, but like my favorite color is purple. It was a decade ago as well. And so they were like, of course you figured out how to do your research on something purple. And I was like, that was just a happy accident. But because I had like kind of a limited time to do my research and also experiments on it, I had to choose really just one thing to focus on. And so in conservation, we have this thing called like the agents of deterioration. So there are 10 things. So there's light, temperature. These are things that can affect objects and collections. So you got light, temperature, relative humidity, pollutants, pests, physical forces, fire, water, thieves, vandals, and custodial neglect. And so I decided to actually focus on the relative humidity and see if fluctuations in that, or if it's too high or too low, maybe that was what was affecting things. And so I'll just do a really quick look at what is wampum. I don't think we need to go too much into this because we've been discussing it already. But you got the cylindrical beads, which come, the purple ones come from the quahog shell, so the mollusk shell. And then you've also got the white ones that come from the whelk. And so when I looked at, kind of did an environmental scan to see if there was any research that had been done on the deterioration of wampum beads as they pertain to belts, there hadn't been any at that time. There still hasn't really been any. Mostly what had been looked at was just kind of this thing like efflorescence or Bynesian disease or decay, Bynesian decay. And that's just kind of like a breakdown of shells that are like the mollusk shell, but it was looking at the shells themselves and natural history functions, not necessarily as they pertain to beads. So I was kind of going into it with absolutely no backing research. So it's right from the very first part. So when you look at the wampum belts, so when you've got like the beads on the belts, composed of wampum beads woven into threads or wefts using a loom, which were held in place by leather ties or warps. So belts were composed mainly of sinew or fiber threads held in place with hide warps. And so if it was bass fiber, that was being used, those could be made out of plants such as milkweed, dogbane, stinging nettle, and in some cases the slippery elm. So again, this is what was being focused on when I was at the Smithsonian, was the care of or the best practices towards these threading materials, but not the beads. So here are a few examples of like the bead breakage that I was talking about that I was seeing. So the structure of wampum belts dictates that both the beads and threading materials are necessary to form the text of the belts, and the loss of wampum beads with the threading material still intact indicates a failure of the structure of the beads themselves. So there are many factors that could be affecting this breakage, such as age of the bead, poor manufacturing, abrasive damage, or inappropriate environmental conditions. So again, because I only had a limited amount of time in my year, I couldn't look at everything, so I decided to focus on relative humidity. And so the theory being that because the belts are composed of various different materials, they're called composite objects. So optimal conditions or the best conditions for one thing, like the threads, may not be the best for the beads. So I examples here. So some of them, the beads are completely missing, and some of them you see the beads are just kind of half broken, but these are beads that may at some point in the future be lost from the belt. And these are just very specifically the ones that I had seen at the NMAI. There are ones that I've seen in later years that had whole sections actually missing, beads missing. And one more example. So it happened in both the purple and the white beads. So down to my experiments. I had to read my dissertation like 4 times to figure out what it was that I did 10 years ago. I was like, wow, that was so hard. I have no idea what it means now. So the relative humidity test, so I'll call it RH from now on, relative humidity. So the RH test and the wampum beads were carried out. I used plastic lock and lock containers that were sealed. And within those containers, I actually created little microenvironments. And so I did test each of the lock and lock containers to make sure that they were completely airtight. And so what I used was chemical salts in ionized water. And so certain chemical salts, certain amount in ionized water will create a certain humidity level, especially if you put them in little tiny containers. And so I used 4 different chemical salts to maintain 4 different RH levels. So I used both purple and white beads, 2 of each, which were exposed to stable RH levels. And so I tried 23%, 43%, 54%, and 85% relative humidity, give or take a couple degrees. Just because like 85%, the super high, is kind of representational of what the natural environment would have been that the belts were in. And then 23% is really, really dry, much drier environment. And then in environments, typically you'll see about 40 to 60% is acceptable in display and storage. So I wanted to pick 2 amounts, so the 43 and the 54, to kind of fit within what museums use right now to see if that's affecting them. I only had 60 days really to do the experiments. And I did have, you can kind of see in the pictures, there's you really can't actually see. So there's tiny little strips. They're actually RH monitors. So when I would open the drawers and I would look, I could see what the RH level was. But in 3 of the containers, there's like these yellow machines, and then in the top picture, and then there's 1 white machine in 1 of the containers. And so those were actually tiny tag data loggers. And so it actually monitored for the whole 60 days. So once I took everything out and I opened it, I was able to download the information, and it actually showed me exactly what the relative humidity and the temperature levels were and if they fluctuated. Because actually temperature really does affect relative humidity. So you really want to keep the temperature as stable as much as possible. I put them in drawers to kind of make sure nobody knocked them and that they weren't jostled or anything, and also kept them in the dark because I didn't want the light to affect the experiments as well. So I would check them a couple times a week just to make sure, because it was just little petri dishes of the chemical saturated salt solution. So I had to make sure that the salt crystals weren't like migrating onto the beads as well, and just to make sure that the temperatures were staying the same. So I did actually, just to see if this affected it, I did also get brain tan, deer hide, bass fiber, and sinew, just to see if maybe the materials that the belts are threaded with, because the belts are in contact with it. I was like, oh, maybe that does affect it. We'll see what happens. So I did have a couple of the beads in contact with those threading materials also in the drawers. To see if it made any sort of difference. And so the sinew I actually got in its raw form from a red deer cull near the Scottish border, while the bass fiber and deer hide were purchased from appropriated sellers. Actually, the hide came from Manitoba buckskin in Winnipeg, and the beads themselves actually came from 6 Nations of the Grand River. And I did talk to people there also to get to do some consultation with the community in terms of this research and how they thought it would be the best way and whether it would be appropriate to do this research. So the beads that I obtained, I got them in November 2013, and they've been manufactured within the previous 5 years. So I kind of had an idea of like how new the beads were. So this is me preparing the beads, tiniest beads ever. They were very, very small, but I had to make sure that I was always looking at the same spot on the beads to examine the same spot every time. So here I am incising a 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter section on the end of the beads using a scalpel, and I sliced up my fingers so much, so I had to clean the beads, like blood off the beads, because I was like, maybe the blood affects like how the beads are doing. So yeah, that was a good time. Let's see. Okay, so I looked at all the beads before putting them in the little microenvironments. So I had three analytical techniques that I looked at. So in the middle, you've got the dynalite, which is optical microscopy. So it's kind of a visual, it's a bit of a microscope, but just a bit more flexible. So I was zoomed in on the beads to see what they looked like before I put them in. And then I also did the FTIR, it's Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy. So that was used to identify chemical characteristics of the shell beads and distinguish any chemical changes that may have occurred during the course of the experiment. And then the one on the right, that is scanning white light interferometry. So I used the Zygo machine at Imperial College London. And then I had the MetroPro software at school on the computers to kind of assess the data that I was getting. And so what that did is it actually looked at the surface roughness of the beads on a micro level. So like I said, you had the dynalite, which kind of was a microscope. This one was like really intense, zooming in on the surface. So it would tell me the surface roughness, but it would tell me the exact measurements on the length, width, and depth. And so these cracks were absolutely tiny ones that you couldn't see with the naked eye, but you could see with this machine. And so in terms of my results, so I'm just showing one example here of one analytical technique, but for the one where I did the chemical analysis, the FTIR, so there are minimal changes on 26 of the 32 samples. And so I have it written here, and this is what I'm talking about when I said I'm looking at my research 10 years later, because I wrote in my dissertation that these minimal changes could be attributed to a vibrational carbonyl CO group as a deterioration of carbonyl protein in live mollusks occurs because of said oxidation. I have no idea what that means. I still haven't figured out what that means just yet. I knew it. Yeah, but in terms of visual, so using the dynalite, the visual examination, I actually found I was only really able to look at the purple beads because the white ones were just too reflective. I couldn't see any changes. I couldn't really look at the surface very well. But I did notice that the three lowest, the 23, 43, and 54 did have flaking of the surface on the purple ones under the dynalite. And there was no changes that happened with the ones that were exposed to 85% humidity. But in the example shown here, this is what the software showed me for the Zygo machine, for the scanning white light interferometry. And so this is just one example of the beads. And so at the top, the two images show what it looked like before being exposed, and then what they look like after 60 days of exposure. And so this one is bead number 2, and it was exposed to the lowest relative humidity, so the 23%, and it had a lot of roughening of the surface. And so when I'm talking about micro cracks, like the little red squares actually show on the bottom how the cracks widened. And actually, yeah, they widened and they deepened slightly. So it was like 0.028 millimeters. So again, it was only 60 days, but when you think about these belts that have been maybe in collections for 100 years, like how much cracking and how big are these cracks? Like what is happening to these beads over that longer periods of time? And so this is just kind of like a little summary of my results. I honestly was a little surprised based on these results because I would have thought that 23 was the most and then 85 was the least, because again, 85 is more like the natural environment, very humid, 23 is very dry, but for some reason 43 was showing up as the most damaging in the research that I did. Again, it was only 60 days, very preliminary. I would recommend that, well, I was planning initially to do more research on it and to have like longer times and to be able to do it in a space where I could control the environment a little bit more than I could at my school. But yeah, this is what came up, which is pretty interesting. But when you take that into account and you have to think about the threading materials, obviously I can't say, well, we should put it at 85, because if you put a walking belt at 85 degrees or 85% relative humidity, you're gonna have all the threads just rot away pretty quickly. So my recommendation was basically that because you have the composite materials, it was like the higher end of the acceptable range in museums. So again, I said it was like 40 to 60, so maybe around 55 as much as possible, because it does fluctuate a couple degrees. So yeah, and taking that into consideration, it wouldn't rot the threading materials, but it may be better for the beads to keep them a little bit more humidified. And so this is actually how I finished my presentation at my symposium when I did my research. So I had this quote, and it's from 2004. And so this was my presentation I did in 2014. And so it came from Sherilyn Ogden from the Causes of Deterioration and Preventative Care. And so as is commonly the case with Indigenous objects in museum collections, factors in terms of conservation, preservation, and respect must be considered. Therefore, quote, preservation becomes a judgment call, balancing act, a compromise. And so if you're looking at it nowadays, that has changed even the 10 years from when I first put this quote in my dissertation. Because when she wrote it in 2004, it was talking about a compromise, a judgment call. And the judgment call was being made by the museums, and it was being made by the conservators and the staff in the museums without, not all museums, I don't want to say blanket all museums are doing this, but it was still kind of prevalent in that attitude of we know what's best for your object, so we'll make that judgment call. And the compromise will be how we're happy with that compromise. Whereas nowadays, there's a lot more involvement of the communities and the communities having say in terms of what is happening with the objects and the treatments, and the different museums recognizing that just having degrees in these fields doesn't mean that you know what's best for the objects, and that the knowledge keepers, the community members, the elders are the ones who should be consulted when treating objects. So I'm going to use that to just kind of pivot really quickly into my other field, which is curating. So I did actually go back to school. Like I said, I was working at the Manitoba Museum, fell into a curatorial role. And over COVID, I actually ended up going back to school and getting another degree in curating, because my supervisor, Dr. Morgan Matthews, kept saying, like, your experience is outstripping your qualifications, you need to go back to school. So she was the one who pushed me into it. It was her fault. But I thank her for it because I had a really good time doing that program. And so I did it at the University of Winnipeg, and it was a one-year master's program, which was very, very intense. But again, I did enjoy it. But one of the things that we talked about a lot during that program was decolonization. And it was something that I was experiencing in the Manitoba Museum. So talking about decolonization and reconciliation within the museums. And it's like I said, for years, institutions and museums all over the world have had custody and patrimony over Indigenous cultural material, memory, and history. And so, again, I'm speaking about Canada, where I'm from, but in Canada, the notion of decolonization was fast becoming a critical paradigm in the museum field. As such, many institutions in Canada have stated that they're committed to decolonization as a form of reconciliation, which is great in theory. But the problem that we encounter a lot of the times is the fact that the institution's version of decolonization is really different than what we as a community actually consider decolonization. And so here are just a few outlines from a general Indigenous perspective of decolonization. So what we find a lot of the times is that you have museums who think that diversity and inclusion are kind of one-shot ways of decolonization. So they can say, hey, we've got this percentage of Indigenous staff within our institutions. Like, look how we're checking this box. Yeah, but where are they in the museum? Like, where in the usually pyramid structure of the museum? Are they on the decision-making power levels? Are they on the board? Are they the ones that aren't just being consulted as an Indigenous advisory circle brought in late in the process? So you can kind of have a gold star to say we did talk to the community. So that's one thing that actually comes up a lot is, yeah, that's great, you got all these staff, but they need to be higher up in in the structure of the museums. And so another critical aspect for decolonization is for institutions to understand what genuine, respectful, and reciprocal relationships with Indigenous communities look like, and how crucial they are in the care of Indigenous objects and collections in museums, and for example, to the accuracy and completeness of records and research in other types of institutions. For a long time, one thing that museums had a tendency to do, whether it was researchers, curators, archaeologists, anthropologists, etc., they would just go into the community and they would just kind of mine information. So it was really predatory practices where it was like going in, grabbing what they wanted, getting the information they wanted, and then delivering it in a way that they wanted to deliver it. So a big thing that I did at the museum with Maureen, her and I were really focused on the fact that the museum was not the one telling the stories. Because that's happened for decades, for centuries. So we want to make sure that the museum was a platform for the community to tell their own stories in the way that they wanted it to be told. Basically, like, screw the museum focus. Because that was a really big thing when you're writing text. It's like, it all has to match. It's like, yeah, okay. We'll do it this way and I'll ask for forgiveness later. And so, yeah, it's no longer acceptable for them to go in and mine information. Relationship building within the communities and with the communities can be a long process, one that needs to be carried out with the utmost respect. And my experience too is that the institutions have a tendency to think that these relationships will be between the institution and the community. And in my experience, that generally is not what happens. It's with the individuals within those institutions. So the community trusts those individuals that they're working with. So if those individuals leave or they get pushed out, because also a lot of the times they may be, this is what happened to me too, a thorn in the side of the higher ups, because of saying, well, you can't do stuff that way. That's not respectful. Well, it takes too long to do it this way. And me insisting that compensation needs to happen for the community for sharing their knowledge was also something that they found really irritating. So I was like, that's fine, I'm okay with that. And it's one of those things too, where it's also trying to explain why these processes take so long. And that when you have these relationships and those people leave, it's not just emailing an Excel sheet of contact information. That's not the way it works within the institution. So if you're pushing those people out, you're losing those relationships as well. And the thing too is because like the museums and other institutions in Canada and around the world are inherently colonial and function through institutional frameworks that just don't work. Indigenous anything doesn't work effectively within these frameworks. And the relationships I'm talking about are made with individuals or individuals within the institution who recognize and respect this process. And what I talk about too is the fact that these individuals do not necessarily need to be Indigenous themselves. They can be allies of the Indigenous communities as long as they are respected and recognized by the communities. They can't go into these institutions and just claim that they have this I guess that they're the ones that can be the voice for the community. But if the community turns around and says, yeah, no, we don't want that person, and the institution isn't listening, then that is also problematic. Also came up with them at the museum, which was super frustrating. And so these relationships are expected to be ongoing, and institutions need to recognize that these relationship building and maintenance processes need to be budgeted for. And like it actually needs to be part of the budget and not just a line item that's added later on in the fact. So, and to recognize that it takes a lot of time to build these relationships. So if you want a project done in 6 months, that's not going to happen, especially if you don't have initial contacts within there, and that they need to be reciprocal. So if the community, for any reason, needs something from the museum 5 years down the road, then that's something that should happen and the museum should be okay with and expect to happen. And communities and elders are the knowledge keepers in these instances, and their time should be respected and compensated accordingly. There is so much knowledge within the Indigenous community and such a willingness to share when these relationships are respectful and reciprocal. And so when we talk about reconnecting with the belongings, reconnecting with these objects, elder objects, teachers within these collections. When you have this type of proper, respectful, reciprocal relationships, this is when these connections really can be made within the community, and it's beneficial for the institution as well, and not just the community, where the institution recognizes that they can learn from the community and change their attitudes in that way. And one of the things I list on here is like institutions needing to change their attitudes from owners of objects to custodians of collection. Because even though they may technically own it, if they can change their attitudes in terms of thinking, well, this is ours, so we can say what we're gonna do with it. And instead thinking like, well, we are just the ones taking care of it, and you're the one who's gonna tell us how we should do that, then that opens up so much more for both the institution and the community in terms of reconnecting. I'm gonna finish there because I'm going over time. Finish.
Hi, Melissa Morton, Institute for Advanced Study. Thank you, that's fabulous. There's a question in the chat. Thank you. There's about 50 people online right now, so I have to remember that also there's a wider audience, and that's really wonderful. Thank you for sharing and opening this symposium to the public, he says. Really helps understand the depth of the impact of colonialism and the resilience of Indigenous communities in the Bible and reconnecting. Can you suggest museums where these items are displayed from an Indigenous narrative perspective? And I know that the AMH conservation fellows were talking about this yesterday too, but I'll kind of pass it to.
Yeah, I sorry, I can't really think of an example off the top of my head right now, but there are a lot. And privately run cultural centers are doing that work. And with that said, First Americans Museum that just opened in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. So Harrington also went down to Oklahoma, and they did that work to reconnect. And I think one of their opening shows was Unico Life of an Object. And they received, I think, a rather large grant to continue doing the reconnecting work, and it's on their website. So First American Museum would be a great place to visit or even look up, as well as many cultural centers that are opening today. I think a note to talk about museums is, you know, colonial practices and museums are kind of like well instituted and difficult to get around and move aside to recreate Indigenous informed museum practices. So it is, you know, often that you might go to a tribal community and they still kind of institute some of those practices, but a lot of them are changing the narrative now. So I would look to local tribes for those exhibitions.
I guess I can say also what I had mentioned in my presentation, that Manitoba Museum does have quite a bit of their exhibition space that was redone. It was 42% of gallery spaces that were updated in this Bringing Our Stories Forward project that they had done, and that's what I was developing the Indigenous content for. But it was one of those things where, again, it took extra labor and extra time because I had to pretty much viciously protect the content that I was putting in there, because there were people who were coming in to change it, ones who were not involved in the consultation process, they weren't involved with the research, they wanted to come in and change, just do some editing, and sometimes those edits would end up changing the context of what I was writing, sometimes made it completely false. And so I had to reiterate to them that this is what I have final approval with the community for. So the validation process, we've gone back and forth to make sure this is what they want. So just leave it alone, don't touch anything. So I was pretty proud in terms of what Maureen and I were able to do with that gallery space, because it does include a lot of first person narratives, and it does include context and information presented in the way that the community wanted it presented.
Do we have other questions? I have a question. So go ahead. Just a question for Mary Deleary. Oh, sorry.
Stephanie, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Stovall-Shrine. Question from Mary Deleary. They were all great presentations, by the way. When you were talking about the color and on the, did you ever find, here's a quick question. You know how like the Navajo, you can have like the family pattern and you can look at the rug and you got the family. So my question is, did you ever find anything about patterns or colors that go to families? Thank you.
I need the mic.
Oh, you want this? Run it to you. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I don't think I've gotten that far yet. But the only example that I can think of is Mrs. John Henry items. I think that there are similarities in the maker and the maker's hand based on beadwork pattern and design and use of materials. So I think there's some connection there. But that's work that needs to happen.
I can say something really quickly to that too. The curator that I worked with, Dr. Maureen Matthews, she's someone that is a good example of what I'm talking about when I say somebody who's an ally, who's not Indigenous themselves. But I don't know when that's doing that.
Yeah, Amanda moved towards the speaker.
So she's an ally of the community and she's worked in the community for decades. And she's worked with beadwork for decades. And so it's to the point where she can look at beadwork and she can identify the time frame based on the type of beads that are being used, but she's able to identify a lot of the times the communities that they come from based on the designs, and sometimes even right down to who the maker is based on other examples of beadwork in the Manitoba Museum collection, but in other collections around the world. Like she had such a deep font of knowledge for that type of information. So that's the type of thing where it's like, because she's worked for decades with the community, her knowledge base is absolutely amazing when she can look at something and she's like, that looks like this person. Wow.
Thank you.
Hi, Claire Garland. I have a question about how would cold temperature affect items versus hot temperatures or heat artifacts?
The way that with temperatures, if the lower the temperature, the lower the humidity level will be, and the higher the temperature, the higher the humidity would be. So if you think about the summer times when you've got really high heat and you've got insanely high temperature or insanely high humidity, say especially on the East Coast, that's where they correspond. So we want to kind of, when I was doing my research and my experimentations, I wanted to keep the temperature pretty stable because it could affect how much my relative humidity was moving around. And so when I did those data loggers, I did see that the ones that had the amount of 54, they did fluctuate more than the other ones did because they were actually in a different drawer. And for some reason that I did have, if you saw there was a digital little recorder in the middle of all my little cases. And so that actually also recorded the relative humidity and the temperatures of just the drawers themselves. So I did see that drawer's temperature did move a bit more than the other drawers did. So it ended up affecting my relative humidity in those little micro environments. John's also a conservator. You don't ask me.
I had to step out for a minute, so hopefully this didn't come up. But you had mentioned those steps to indigenize museums in general as institutions. What might we do to indigenize conservation as a museum discipline itself?
A really big thing in terms of conservation and I guess decolonizing, indigenizing conservation that I push a lot towards is when I talk to especially youth, like what I was saying is to get more First Nations, get more Indigenous conservators in the field who have that knowledge already, that cultural knowledge that they can incorporate into their practices and to kind of guide what is happening within these institutions, but also moving into those positions where they are the managers or they're the directors of those departments in the museum. One thing that I really did like when I worked at the Smithsonian at the NMAI is they did have a lot of people who would come in from the communities, and they were the ones who would guide us on how we were going to work on the objects and what materials we would use, what materials they would use, and how what our best practices would be for that. And I did work at other institutions that didn't incorporate that at all, and I thought that was really unfortunate because they weren't getting that knowledge in terms of how to work within it. But the reality is with conservation, there's a lot of barriers to get into it. I was actually talking to, I don't think Lily's here right now, but we were talking about it before, like there's the financial barrier. When you get into conservation, if you're going to go into a program in North America, you're expected to have an undergrad degree already that's in a related field, and you have to have thousands of hours of experience before you even apply to these master's programs. It is changing nowadays, which is great that internships are starting to be paid, but previously the reality was you worked for thousands of hours for free to get this experience. And then you applied to go to these institutions, you left your communities, you left your families, you left your support systems to go and get this training. So that's why we had very few First Nations, Indigenous conservators in the field. Move there. So we got 3 in the room, which is fantastic.
Yeah, please.
Oh,
You go on.
could I speak or?
Yes. I just.
Want people on Zoom to hear?
You can go up to the front.
Hello, James McGuire. I'm currently I'm in an Indigenous Fellowship for Conservation at AMNH. So these things are happening. And our people, we move into the world with the directive as we go into these halls of these colonial hellscapes. We use phrases to help them understand. And one of them is nothing about us without us, right? And when we say these, we mean it. And in the relationships that we build in the field, they hear them and absorb them and create programs like Samantha's created to bring us into these spaces and support us and pay us. So, it's really beautiful. So, Samantha, John too. And, let's indigenize these spaces every time. I like to say this is kind of a way to explain it sometimes to people that can't hear what it's like to be in museums. It's like as if somebody stole your car and then you just saw your car pass you. You're like, hey, that's my car. They're driving it. And they're like, oh yeah, no, I stole it. Right, maybe. And then you sit in the front seat and tell me where to go. Drive my car. And I think that's the way it feels for us in these museums. Is like, just give us the wheel a little bit. Let us show you how to handle these belongings. We call them Gilan. And let us guide you to make this world a little bit better place for us. So yeah, it's really nice to hear that. I had a question about the beads.
Oh, no.
No, it's not hard. Has there ever been any work in the genetics of the shells to find out exactly which beach they're from?
Well, that's another thing. Oh. Well, that was another thing when I was trying to figure out what I was going to study very specifically. I know I was going to look at the deterioration of hormone, but what was I going to look at affecting it? And so when I had decided, like I said, on relative humidity, but things that came up was like, well, how old are the beads? If you look at the beads, you can see when it was kind of a famine year versus a feast year and in the development of the bead, and that could also affect it, but it would also be affected by temperatures of the oceans and where the shells developed. So again, it could go so many different ways to examine what could be affecting the beads, and I can only choose one thing, and I can only test it for 60 days, so.
Give her more time.
I did want to mention something that was really interesting though, but kind of what you were saying, is I about 2 years ago that I was asked to present at the Association of Manitoba Museums as a conservator. because smaller institutions were wondering if they had sacred objects in their collections, and they said, can you come in and can you speak about sacred objects and how do it like a list, like tell them what they need to look for in their collections, and I kind of went, okay. So I came in and I put up a slide and I said, so this is a list of things that could be sacred, and then I changed it, just the color of the slide, and it's the exact same list, and I was like, here's a list of things that might not be sacred. I can't tell you, I can't give you a list. Like as much as in museums, we love lists and policies and manuals. I can't give you a list. You need to talk to the communities, and the communities will be the one who will tell you what is sacred. And that's the best way. And it is daunting for institutions, but I think it's changing. They're learning, which is very hopeful. It's kind of like having the attitude of hopeful. That's why I love coming to gatherings like this, because you might get down on some things that are happening in your institution, and then you gatherings like this, and you have that renewed hope.
People like you guys are why they're changing, so thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
Hello, my name is Marina Tsaplina. I'm a Russian-born immigrant and settler, and I know my grandfather comes from the Ural Mountains, and my own lineage is quite fractured. I wanted to offer something that I know about intervention to the colonial hellscape of museums is that there's a show right now at the Arts Center of the Capital Region in colonial named Troy, New York, and it's called Little Brown Jug and Dig Deeper, Some Art, Science, and History of Troy Clay. And I share this because my friend Margaret put the show together, and as she was putting the show together, she's a ceramicist and it's a local clay. She's a multi-generation settler, and she had basically this burgeoning awakening of, oh my God, the entire history of this clay that we're telling is deeply colonial. And so we had multiple conversations, and she kind of basically began to peel back the layers about this clay and what people were working with. And so there are active interventions in that exhibit into the colonial imagination, into the way the story of this clay was told. And of this place and region and all of that. And also that I heard Jake Edwards of the Onondaga Nation describe how the Erie Canal was, quote, one of the biggest genocidal acts in American history. And that quote's on the wall because I brought that quote to her because the clay came next to the first lock of the Erie Canal. So I also just I share this because if you're anywhere within this region, you can come. This exhibit is up through the 16th, and I can speak for Margaret that she's very kind of open for deep community kind of undoing what the initial narrative that the show was put together with, and just radically undoing the colonial imagination. So yeah, it's through November 16th.
Hi, I'm Katie Sabella from the American Museum of Natural History. I work in collections. I just wanted to say thank you to Suzanne and Ian for your presentation on Nanatis. She's someone that, is very much on my mind as we think about next steps for those spaces, whatever, version they may take. We're going to go through a deinstallation process. So I'm hoping, it's not really a question, but I'm hoping that we can continue to work together and talk and build on the work that's been done to make sure that we approach her in the right way and that we work with communities to do that. So I just wanted to thank you for what you shared, and to Suzanne for sharing feedback about the database and the archives. You're certainly being heard. I just want you to know that. I think our database is a source of frustration for all of us at this point, and there may be an opportunity to revisit it. So hearing what we can do to, what fields are important for the different people who are using them, not just staff, but for communities, and thinking about family names or genealogies, that's something that I hadn't really considered before. So I'm gonna make sure to pass that along to people back at the museum. Thank you.